At 8:38 p.m., a small Piper Saratoga lifted into the summer sky from Essex County Airport in New Jersey. On board were 3 people. John F. Kennedy Jr., the man America had watched since he was a child saluting his father's coffin. Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy, the woman America had turned into a symbol, a mystery, a wife, a style icon, and finally, a problem. And Lauren Bessette, Carolyn's older sister, a successful woman with a life of her own, though history would too often place her in the margins of a tragedy built around a famous name. They were flying to a family wedding. It was meant to be a short trip, the kind of summer journey that should have ended with lights on the runway, luggage in the back of a car, voices in a house waiting up for them. Around 9:40 p.m., the plane disappeared from radar. There was no dramatic farewell, no final public statement, no warning that would make the story easier to bear later. There was only haze, ocean, darkness, and a route that did not end where it was supposed to. In the houses waiting for them, people expected the phone to ring. A cousin waited, a bride waited, friends waited, families waited, and for a brief, terrible moment, the woman who had been called cold, elegant, difficult, flawless, spoiled, stylish, mysterious, and impossible became none of those things. She was simply missing. Before the headlines hardened, before the old words returned, before the Kennedy curse was dragged once more into the light, there was only absence. But Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy's tragedy did not begin in the sky. It began much earlier, in a quieter way, with the public's need to make her into something she had never promised to be. America did not just watch Carolyn. It assigned her a role. It wanted her to be the next perfect Kennedy woman, graceful but not needy, beautiful but not vain, private but available, stylish but humble, strong but never visibly angry. It wanted the glow of Jackie, the youth of the 90s, the discipline of fashion, and the emotional silence of a woman who would make the Kennedy name look safe again. And when Carolyn resisted that role, when she did not smile on command, when she did not make her private pain easy to consume, the public did what it often does to women who refuse a beautiful script. It blamed her for ruining the fairy tale. Long before the Kennedy name, Carolyn Bessette was not born into old money, and she was not trained for a dynasty. That is what the public later forgot. She was born on January the 7th, 1966, in New York, the youngest of 3 daughters. Her mother, Anne Messina, came from a Brooklyn Italian-American family and carried the kind of will that does not announce itself politely. Her father, William Bessette, was a civil engineer from Connecticut, a man shaped by order, discipline, and private strain. From the outside, the family could look like an ordinary American success story. 3 daughters, a working father, a capable mother, a house in the suburbs, a life that seemed to be moving upward. But children know when the air in a house is tense. Carolyn learned early that a room could look normal and still feel dangerous. Her childhood was not the frozen perfection people later tried to attach to her. It had movement, disruption, divorce, remarriage, and reinvention. Her parents separated when she was still young, and the shape of her life changed before she had the language to explain what had happened. There were new arrangements, new houses, new adults, new rules, and new silences. Her mother later married Dr. Richard Freeman, an orthopedic surgeon, and Carolyn entered a more comfortable world in Greenwich, Connecticut. To outsiders, Greenwich would later seem like the natural explanation for everything about her. The restraint, the polish, the clean clothes, the cold beauty people thought they understood. But Carolyn did not arrive there as a girl born to private schools and inherited ease. She arrived as a child who had already learned that life could change without asking her permission. That difference matters because the world later treated her elegance as if it proved she should be able to endure anything. People looked at the blonde hair, the long frame, the quiet clothes, the unbothered posture, and assumed she had been built for pressure. They assumed that a woman who looked composed must be protected by that composure. But elegance can be a mask learned early. It can be a way of entering rooms where you are not sure you belong. It can be a discipline, not a birthright. Carolyn was not a Kennedy princess in training. She was a girl learning how to survive rooms she had not built. Friends from childhood remembered the warmth beneath that control. They remembered her laugh, the kind that did not match the later photographs. They remembered her ability to make people feel chosen. She could be funny, quick, physical, teasing, and unexpectedly tender. She had a way of crossing a room and making one person feel for a moment like the whole room mattered less than them. That was part of her gift. But even as a young girl, she understood attention. She knew when she was being watched. She knew when people expected a performance. She knew that in certain rooms, beauty could be a door, but it could also become a claim. At school, Carolyn did not fit neatly into a single category. She was not merely the perfect student, not merely the pretty girl, not merely the rebel, not merely the social girl. She moved between people. She noticed the ones on the edges. She understood social temperature. She could make the room softer or sharper, depending on what was needed. That instinct would later serve her in fashion, where reading people was as important as reading fabric. But it also came from a deeper place. Carolyn knew what it meant to adjust quickly. A child of divorce learns the weather in adults' faces. A girl moving between family worlds learns when to speak, when to laugh, when to leave, and when to make someone else feel less alone. By the time she reached Boston University, Carolyn had entered a wider and less polished world. Boston was not Greenwich. It was colder, louder, more crowded, and more alive. The campus spread through the city rather than sitting apart from it. Streets, trains, dorms, bars, classrooms, apartments, late shifts, and early mornings all blurred together. Carolyn studied, worked, made friends, waited tables, babysat, and lived the kind of young adult life that does not match the later myth of a remote-style icon. She was not gliding through life in black silk. She was earning money, joking with friends, making mistakes, going out, coming home tired, and learning who she was when no one was styling her. Her friends remembered that she liked fun, but disliked losing control. She could drink, laugh, stay out, flirt, and disappear into a group, but she did not like feeling untethered. She wanted to know where her feet were. That detail matters because control would become one of the quiet themes of her life. Not control over other people, though tabloids would later imply that. Control over herself. Control over her image. Control over her exits. Control over what parts of her could be seen and what parts had to remain private. In a world that would later try to take all of her, that instinct was not vanity. It was survival. Her early relationships taught her another lesson. She could be passionate, but she did not want to be powerless. When love became messy, She learned to protect herself by leaving first. Friends heard her joke about dating, training, and moving on, but the joke had a wall inside it. It was not that she lacked feeling. It was that she did not trust the world to handle her feelings gently. Later, when the public called her cold, it missed the possibility that what looked like distance was a woman trying not to be caught helpless. Sometimes what looks like ice is only someone refusing to bleed where strangers can watch. Then came Calvin Klein. The fit was almost too exact to feel accidental. Calvin's world was built on restraint, clean lines, pale spaces, black dresses, white shirts, bodies made architectural by fabric. Carolyn understood that language instinctively. She did not only sell clothing. She understood how clothing could change the way a person entered a room. She could read clients, sense insecurity, lower the temperature, sharpen the look, and make simplicity feel like power. She understood that fashion was not just about fabric. It was about permission. A woman came in unsure of herself, and Carolyn could show her a version of herself that looked calmer, stronger, more edited. Her style was not only taste, it was control. In a world determined to read her face, her clothes became the one language she could still edit. Before the paparazzi turned her into a public object, Carolyn already understood that less could say more. A black dress could refuse explanation. A white shirt could become armor. Sunglasses could become a boundary. Minimalism did not make her empty. It gave her a shape the world could not easily clutter. But the trap of Carolyn's style was cruel. The less she gave the cameras, the more they wanted from her. Restraint became mystery. Mystery became a market. And eventually, the image she controlled began to control her. Inside Calvin Klein, Carolyn saw how images were made before the public believed they were natural. She saw celebrities come in carrying insecurity under fame. She saw models become ideas. She saw the difference between private bodies and public images. She worked with clothes, but she was also working with perception. That experience would later make the public's treatment of her even more painful. She understood image-making too well to be innocent about it. She knew what a photograph could do. She knew what a dress could suggest. She knew what withholding could create. But she could not stop the machine once it decided she was the image. By the early 1990s, Carolyn was moving through the kind of Manhattan world where celebrities, models, editors, actors, assistants, and beautiful strangers crossed the same spaces. She was not famous in the way the people she dressed were famous, but she was noticed. There are people who enter a room loudly, and there are people who change the room without announcing themselves. Carolyn was the second kind. She could be casual and severe at the same time. She could wear something simple and make everyone else look overdone. She could sit at a table and seem both present and withheld. That combination drew people in because it refused to explain itself. When John F. Kennedy Jr. walked into that world, he brought something no ordinary man could carry. John was handsome, charming, and approachable in the way people said Kennedys could be. But he was also a national wound walking around in a beautiful body. To many people, he was still the little boy from the funeral, the child who saluted, the heir to an American myth that had never stopped glowing. He had grown into a man, but the public had not fully allowed him to become one. He was expected to be charming, decent, handsome, available, noble, masculine, wounded, promising, and somehow still connected to a past he had been too young to choose. That is why Carolyn's response to him mattered. She did not appear to bow to the legend. She treated him like a man standing in front of her, not a monument that needed candles. That may be part of why he wanted her. For a man who had been watched since childhood, a woman who refused to perform awe could feel like oxygen. She asked questions. She teased. She did not automatically arrange herself around the Kennedy name. To date John was one thing. To become the woman beside him was something else entirely. Carolyn may not have known the full cost yet, but she understood enough to be cautious. Their relationship was not simple, and it should not be flattened into a perfect romance. They could be affectionate, funny, physical, and deeply connected. They could also be volatile, proud, defensive, and overwhelmed. What made the relationship dangerous was not only who they were together, but who the world needed them to become. John could never be just a boyfriend. Carolyn could never be just a girlfriend. Once the Kennedy name touched the relationship, privacy became temporary. Every dinner, every argument, every dress, every public pause had the potential to become public property. Jackie Kennedy Onassis's death deepened that pressure. With Jackie gone, the public hunger for a perfect Kennedy woman did not disappear. It moved. Quietly, unfairly, it began looking at Carolyn. Jackie had been remembered as the standard. Composed, elegant, silent under pressure, perfectly dressed, almost superhuman in grief. The public had turned her suffering into style and her restraint into mythology. Now, Carolyn was being pulled toward that same impossible frame. She was expected to be modern and classic, spontaneous and controlled, private and available. A woman with her own life and also a continuation of someone else's memory. Carolyn did not marry only a man. She married into a national memory that already had rules for how a Kennedy woman should look, suffer, smile, and stay silent. That is the heart of her story. She was not destroyed because she lacked elegance. She was punished because she refused to make her private pain easy for the public to consume. The America that admired her slip dress and her blonde hair did not always want the human being inside them. It wanted a woman who could make the Kennedy fairy tale feel young again. Their engagement carried that tension. It was private, then not private. Tender, then public. Human, then symbolic. There were fights, reconciliations, hesitations, and moments of ordinary tenderness. But ordinary tenderness was almost impossible for them to keep. The outside world wanted proof, and proof often came in the form of a photograph stolen from the edge of pain. When footage of them arguing surfaced, it did not become evidence of a couple under pressure. It became entertainment. The public did not ask what it meant to live under that kind of scrutiny. It watched the discomfort and turned it into character. Carolyn was difficult. Carolyn was dramatic. Carolyn was the woman who could not handle John. That pattern would repeat again and again. John's complexity was often explained through history. Carolyn's complexity was reduced to attitude. John could be grieving, restless, charming, overwhelmed, boyish, wounded, ambitious, and lost. Carolyn was rarely granted that same range. She was flattened into the woman making the golden boy unhappy. That was the double standard at the center of the fairy tale. His pain had context. Hers became a flaw. His name explained him. Her privacy condemned her. Their wedding on Cumberland Island looked, from the outside, like the perfect answer to America's hunger. It was secret, remote, candlelit, almost impossibly beautiful. The small church had no electricity. The light came from candles and flashlights. Her dress, designed by Narciso Rodriguez, was severe and soft at once, a narrow line of silk that would become one of the most famous wedding dresses of the decade. John fumbled the ring. Carolyn steadied him. The scene seemed intimate, unpolished, human. For a moment there was no country, no cameras, no national expectation. There were only two people standing close in a small church, while the island held the dark around them. But the wedding looked private because there were no cameras inside the church. The myth was already waiting outside. The moment Carolyn became Mrs. Kennedy, her privacy stopped being treated like a right and started being treated like a challenge. America wanted the fairy tale, and it did not like being kept outside the church. The secrecy that made the wedding beautiful also made the public more hungry. When the images finally emerged, the world did not simply admire them. It claimed them. The dress became iconic. The marriage became symbolic. Carolyn became a projection screen. There is a strange cruelty in a secret wedding becoming public property. The details that made it feel intimate were the very details that made it irresistible. The remote island, the small church, the candles, the rain, the dress, the handsome Kennedy groom, the woman who looked as if she had stepped out of fashion and into myth. The public called it romantic because it had been hidden from them. But that secrecy also became the beginning of resentment. America wanted the fairy tale, and it did not like being kept outside the church. The honeymoon made that clear. They tried to disappear, but disappearance was almost impossible. A hotel lobby, a market, a street, a boat, a restaurant. Each could become a stage the moment someone recognized them. Carolyn was not only being photographed, she was being interpreted. How she walked, whether she smiled, where she looked, how close she stood to John, what she wore, what she did not say. She had entered the strange economy of public womanhood where every visible gesture becomes evidence. A laugh proves happiness. A tired face proves contempt. A turned shoulder proves trouble. A refusal to perform becomes a moral failing. Imagine the exhaustion of that. Not simply being watched, but being explained by strangers before you can even understand your own feeling. A woman coming out of a taxi is not allowed to be tired. A woman pausing at a doorway is not allowed to be overwhelmed. A woman hearing cruel comments at a nearby table is not allowed to retreat without being called fragile or proud. Carolyn's public life became a courtroom where the evidence was always her face. By the spring after the wedding, the photographers outside their Northmore Street apartment were no longer an event. They were a schedule. They waited in the morning. They waited at night. They knew when she walked the dog, when John left, when the door opened, when the light changed. The cameras did not only steal privacy, they stole ordinary emotion. A tired face became arrogance. A bad day became evidence. A refusal to smile became a verdict on her character. Carolyn could not simply have a difficult morning. She could not simply look annoyed, exhausted, shy, or sad. Once a woman becomes a public image, her humanity is treated like inconsistency. Carolyn tried to fight the system with the tools she understood. She wore the same kinds of clothes, the same jeans, the same white shirts, the same sunglasses, as if repetition might drain the pictures of value. If every photograph looked alike, maybe they would stop buying them. But repetition only created a new myth. Her uniform became a story. Her sunglasses became a mood. Her silence became a product. Carolyn's silence may have been the last boundary she had left, but the public turned that boundary into mystery, and magazines turned mystery into merchandise. This is why calling her a style icon is both true and incomplete. Yes, her style was extraordinary. Yes, her restraint influenced fashion long after her death. Yes, women still study her clothes, her hair, the way she made simplicity look difficult and expensive. But to remember only the clothes is to miss the cost. The style was admired because it looked controlled. The life behind it was becoming less controllable by the day. The same public that wanted her image also punished her for not giving enough of herself. She was made famous for restraint, then attacked for being restrained. The pressure entered the marriage. How could it not? John had grown up with cameras, but that did not mean he knew how to protect someone else from them. His strategy had been inherited from a family that knew how to survive public life by cooperating just enough. Give them one picture, smile, move on. Jackie had mastered that method, but Carolyn was not Jackie. She did not want to negotiate with intrusion as if it were weather. She felt the invasion in her body. She hated being cornered, followed, shouted at, reduced to a face behind glass. When people advised her to relax, they were asking her to accept the unacceptable gracefully. That is a very old demand placed on women. Be graceful under pressure. Be calm while being invaded. Be elegant while being watched. Do not show anger, because anger will be used against you. Do not show fear, because fear will be called weakness. Do not withdraw, because withdrawal will be called arrogance. Carolyn was expected to suffer beautifully. When she did not, the story turned. The world began to turn her discomfort into character. She was difficult. She was cold. She was unstable. She was not grateful enough. She did not understand what she had married into. These judgments were easy because they protected the myth around John. America wanted John to remain the golden son. So when the marriage looked strained, Carolyn became the easier story. The difficult wife. The cold blonde. The woman who could be blamed without disturbing the myth. This was not only about Carolyn and John. It was about a culture that often chooses a woman to carry the disappointment when a beautiful story becomes complicated. If the fairy tale no longer feels perfect, the wife must have changed. If the man looks tired, she must be the burden. If the public loses access to him, she must be the gatekeeper. If the marriage looks unhappy, she must be the problem. Carolyn became a screen for every frustration people did not want to direct at the Kennedy myth itself. There were arguments. There was tension. Friends saw stress. Tabloids fed on rumors of separation, affairs, loneliness, and collapse. Some of the pain was real, because marriages under pressure often contain real pain. But the public version was not the same as truth. There were always three relationships: the one John and Carolyn lived, the one friends saw, and the one America consumed. The last one was the cruelest because it did not need facts to keep moving. It only needed images, whispers, and a woman convenient enough to blame. The paparazzi made ordinary life feel like exposure. A store visit could become humiliation. A walk could become confrontation. A hospital entrance could become a photograph. A sidewalk could become a courtroom. Carolyn was not only living a marriage, she was living inside a public argument about who she was allowed to be. Was she allowed to be tired? Was she allowed to be angry? Was she allowed to hate the cameras without being called ungrateful? Was she allowed to struggle without being accused of failing the Kennedy story? The answer, too often, was no. The fairy tale required her to be beautiful, but not visibly burdened. Stylish, but not self-protective. Married to John, but not overwhelmed by what came with him. It wanted her to carry the glow of the Kennedy name without showing the burn. And when she did show the burn, the fairy tale turned against her. In private, there were still moments that did not belong to the tabloids. Friends remembered Carolyn as funny, loyal, sharp, and physical in her affection. They remembered the woman who brought gifts, checked in, made jokes, leaned into the people she loved, and could be unexpectedly tender. They remembered the side that never fit the public label. That is what public image destroys first. Proportion. A person becomes one trait. The warm woman becomes cold. The anxious woman becomes arrogant. The private woman becomes mysterious. The struggling woman becomes ungrateful. The public does not need to know the whole person if the label is convenient enough. John, too, was under enormous pressure. It would be wrong and too easy to turn him into the villain of Carolyn's story. He was carrying his own inheritance of grief, expectation, masculinity, public affection, and unfinished legacy. He was trying to build a magazine, maintain a public role, protect family ties, manage his name, and live as a husband under impossible visibility. He had been watched since childhood. He knew the cameras, but knowing them was not the same as escaping them. He could be loving and frustrating, protective and careless, charming and overwhelmed. Like Carolyn, he was human. Unlike Carolyn, he was more often allowed to be human in public memory. The late years of their marriage carried more strain. John's magazine, George, was under pressure. His closest friend and cousin, Anthony Radziwill, was gravely ill with cancer. Family obligations increased. Flying became one of John's private releases, a place where the noise of inheritance and headlines could briefly fall away. Carolyn was facing the pressure of a marriage under siege, a husband pulled by grief, work, family, flying, obligation, and history. None of this makes a clean story. It makes a human one. They were not symbols moving toward fate. They were people trying to keep standing while too many forces pulled at once. By the final year, the tabloids had turned the marriage into a public game. Rumors spread about affairs, separations, fights, loneliness, and collapse. Every crack became entertainment. Every absence became proof. Every sighting became evidence of either reconciliation or ruin. The real marriage was no doubt complicated, but the public marriage was a product, updated weekly, sold through headlines, and consumed by people who felt entitled to an ending. What makes the final days so painful is how ordinary parts of them were. There were conversations with friends, there were plans for dinners, there were worries about family events, there were errands, clothes, appointments, phone calls, gestures of affection, and the small details that make a life feel like it will continue. Carolyn was not walking toward myth. She was moving through errands. She was choosing clothes. She was talking to people she loved. She was making and changing plans. She was still a person with a Sunday imagined ahead of her. On July 16, 1999, Carolyn went through that ordinary day without knowing the world would later freeze it into finality. She had a nail appointment. She went shopping. She chose a dress for the wedding she had agreed to attend. She spoke of John's injury, of the trip, of practical worries. She called people. She made plans. The details have the unbearable tenderness of the last day because they were not designed to be symbolic. They became symbolic only because there were no more days after them. Sunset came at 8:26 p.m. The plane lifted off at 8:38. Dusk arrived soon after, that blue hour between visibility and darkness. On board were John, Carolyn, and Lauren. The route was familiar enough to seem manageable, short enough to feel ordinary. But ordinary is sometimes the most devastating illusion. The plane vanished. The waiting began. At first, there was still room for hope. A delay, a diversion, a radio problem, a misunderstanding. Families survive those hours by bargaining with possibility. Maybe the phone will ring. Maybe someone knows something. Maybe the story has not yet become what the body already fears. At Redgate Farm, people waited. The wedding weekend that had been meant to gather family in celebration turned into a vigil without a clear shape. Phones mattered too much. Every silence had weight. The Coast Guard began searching. Boats and aircraft moved across the route. At first, the word was still rescue. Rescue is a merciful word because it keeps a door open. It allows the mind to imagine a landing somewhere else, a mistake, a delay, a survivable ending. But as the hours passed, the sea offered less and less mercy. By the time debris was found, the language began to change. Missing became feared dead. Feared dead became presumed lost. The cameras gathered again, as they always did around Kennedy grief. Reporters reached for old words because old words are easy when a family has been turned into public tragedy. Curse, Camelot, fate, Dallas, Chappaquiddick. The past collapsed into the present because the media knew that story already. It had been selling that story for decades. But this time, the tragedy was not only Kennedy, it was also Bessette. It was also a mother losing daughters, a family losing sisters, friends losing women. They knew outside the myth. When the wreckage was found off Martha's Vineyard, the final hope ended. The plane lay beneath the water, invisible from the surface. John, Carolyn, and Lauren were gone. The official explanations would come later. Darkness, haze, disorientation. The brutal speed with which a small aircraft can become unrecoverable when the horizon disappears. But before reports and conclusions, there was only confirmation. 3 lives had ended. 3 families had been torn open. And the public, which had watched so much of John and Carolyn's life from the outside, now watched the end from the same distance, hungry and helpless and still looking. Lauren Bessette should not disappear inside the Kennedy story. She was not a footnote in someone else's tragedy. She was a sister, a daughter, a professional woman with her own life, lost because history kept looking first at the famous name. The fact that the public remembers the crash mostly through John and Carolyn says something about fame, but it should not decide the value of a life. Lauren was there. Lauren mattered. In a story about a woman swallowed by a public myth, another woman should not be swallowed too. Outside the places connected to them, strangers gathered. Flowers appeared. Notes were left. Candles burned. At Northmore Street, where Carolyn had once tried to enter and exit her own home under the weight of lenses, grief became another public scene. People came because they were sad, because they remembered the little boy, because they admired Carolyn, because they could not believe the fairy tale had ended so violently. Some came with tenderness. Some came with curiosity. Public grief is never only one thing. It can be love, performance, guilt, memory, and hunger all at once. The families chose the ocean rather than a public grave. That choice matters. A grave connected to the Kennedy name would have become a monument, a pilgrimage site, another place where private grief could be turned into public ritual. Carolyn had been photographed enough. Lauren deserved more than to become a footnote beneath flashbulbs. The sea gave them a privacy the land might not have protected. There were no crowds close enough to claim the final moment. No public choreography large enough to swallow it. Only family, water, wind, and the names of the dead. At the memorial, those who loved them tried to restore what public storytelling had distorted. Carolyn was not only a dress, not only a face, not only the woman in the photographs. She was funny, guarded, warm, sharp, loyal, impatient, stylish, anxious, loving, and real. She could be difficult because real people are difficult. She could be tender because real people are tender. She could be private without being empty. She could be angry without being cruel. She could struggle inside a marriage without becoming the villain of it. But nuance is rarely what the public wants from a woman in a fairy tale. It wants a role. Then it punishes her for being larger than that role. That is the uncomfortable part of Carolyn's legacy. The same public that helped make her image immortal also helped make her life smaller. It admired her style, but resented her boundaries. It praised her elegance, but mocked her silence. It wanted her to be mysterious, but punished her for not explaining herself. It wanted her to continue the Kennedy glow, but refused to ask whether any woman should be asked to live as someone else's national symbol. Today, Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy is often remembered through images: the wedding dress, the black coat, the white shirt, the sunglasses, the sleek hair, the hand held near the face, the long line of her body crossing a sidewalk. The images are beautiful. They deserve to be studied. But they should not be mistaken for the woman. Beauty can preserve a person in memory, but it can also trap her there. Carolyn's style survived because it looked timeless. Her pain was less convenient. It did not fit as neatly on a mood board. Fashion has been kinder to Carolyn than the tabloids were, but even admiration can flatten a woman. To call her only a minimalist icon is to clean the story too much. Minimalism was not only an aesthetic, it was a defense against noise. Her clothes looked calm in a life that was becoming less calm. Her restraint looked effortless because the labor of maintaining restraint was invisible. Her sunglasses looked chic because nobody had to feel what it was like to need them. The image remains beautiful. The cost behind it should not be erased. The fairy tale did not end because Carolyn failed to play her part. It ended because no woman could survive being loved as an image and hunted as a problem. She was not cold. She was watched. She was not ungrateful. She was cornered. She was not a mystery invented for magazines. She was a private woman trying to keep one last boundary in a world that treated boundaries as invitations. America wanted a new Kennedy princess, then resented her for being human. It wanted elegance without exhaustion, beauty without anger, silence without sorrow. So the question is not simply what happened to Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy. The harder question is what the public needed from her while she was alive. Did America love Carolyn, or did it love the role it wanted her to play? Was she cold, or was she punished for not performing warmth on command? Was the Kennedy fairy tale really hers, or was she only the woman placed inside it when the country needed the story to continue. In the end, Carolyn was not destroyed because she lacked elegance. She was punished because she would not make her private pain easy for the public to consume. And long before the plane vanished over the water, the world had already begun taking pieces of her it had no right to own